On February 12, 2026, the National Association of Realtors released its monthly report. Existing home sales fell 8.4% in a single month. The median existing home in America now costs $396,800. The median new home costs $460,000, and 3 out of 4 American households cannot afford one. But buried inside those numbers is something almost nobody in the media is talking about. A hidden tax, not a tax passed by Congress, not a tax you voted for, not a tax that shows up on your pay stub or your closing documents. A tax that is baked into the wood, that frames your walls, holds up your roof, and supports the floor beneath your feet. And it is making every home in America more expensive. To understand how this happened, you need to understand one material: softwood lumber. 93% of new homes built in the United States use softwood lumber as the primary structural material. That is not an estimate. That is the industry's own data from the National Association of Home Builders. Wood frames the walls, wood builds the trusses, wood sheathes the exterior, wood forms the subfloor. A typical new single-family home requires roughly $174,000 worth of building materials, and framing lumber alone accounts for 15 to 20% of that total construction cost. When you add in cabinets, trim, engineered wood products, oriented strand board, and structural panels, wood touches nearly every surface in a modern American home. So when the price of lumber moves, the price of housing moves with it, every time, without exception. Now here is where the story gets uncomfortable. The United States cannot supply its own lumber. Despite having more forest land than almost any country on Earth, despite the fact that American forests grow nearly twice what is harvested every year, America imports roughly 30% of its softwood lumber annually. And 85% of those imports come from a single country, Canada. This is not a new arrangement. It is one of the oldest and most deeply integrated supply chains in North America. For decades, Canadian spruce, pine, and fir have been the backbone of American home building. The species are perfectly suited for residential framing. They are strong, lightweight, straight-grained, and available in the massive volumes that American construction demands. The logistics are seamless. Lumber crosses the border by rail and truck on routes that have been refined over generations. The Canadian market has only 38 million people. The American market has 340 million. So the majority of Canadian production has always flowed south. And for most of the last 40 years, this arrangement has worked. American builders got reliable, affordable supply. Canadian mills got access to the largest housing market in the world. And American homebuyers benefited from the competition that kept prices in check until the tariffs arrived. And not one layer of tariffs, multiple layers, stacked on top of each other, each imposed under a different legal authority, each with its own justification. And each adding cost to the same board of lumber before it reaches the same construction site. Let me walk you through them. Layer 1 is the oldest: anti-dumping and countervailing duties. These have existed in some form since the 1980s. The softwood lumber dispute between the United States and Canada is one of the longest-running trade conflicts in the Western Hemisphere. Longer than most marriages, the core argument is straightforward. Nearly all forest land in Canada is publicly owned by the provinces. It is technically Crown land managed by provincial governments on behalf of the public. Companies lease the right to harvest timber and pay stumpage fees set by the provinces. The United States Department of Commerce has repeatedly determined that these fees are set below market rates, effectively subsidizing Canadian producers. When subsidized lumber crosses the border and undercuts American mills, the Commerce Department imposes countervailing duties to offset the subsidy. When Canadian producers sell lumber in the American market at prices below what they charge at home, anti-dumping duties are added. As of the most recent administrative review, those combined duties stand at approximately 14.5%. But the Commerce Department has signaled that the next review could more than double that rate, to 34.5%. That review is expected to finalize in the fall of 2026. That is Layer 1. Layer 2 arrived on October 14th, 2025. The administration imposed a 10% Section 232 tariff on all softwood timber and lumber imports worldwide, not just from Canada, from everywhere. This tariff was justified on national security grounds. The argument was that dependence on foreign lumber threatens the nation's ability to build homes, military facilities, and critical infrastructure. The Commerce Department was directed to investigate whether imports of timber and lumber pose a threat to national security. The conclusion was yes, and the 10% tariff took effect immediately. So now Canadian lumber faces the anti-dumping and countervailing duties at 14.5%, plus the 10% national security tariff stacked on top. For many Canadian producers, the combined rate already exceeds 24%. For some, depending on company-specific findings, it is above 35%. And if the administrative review doubles the base rate as signaled, the total combined tariff burden could approach 45%. That would be the highest combined rate in the entire history of the softwood lumber dispute. And there's a third layer. Earlier in 2025, The administration imposed tariffs on most Canadian goods under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Those IEEPA tariffs reached 35% on non-USMCA goods from Canada. Now, goods subject to Section 232 timber tariffs are largely exempt from the IEEPA tariffs, so the layers do not stack infinitely. But the net effect is that Canadian lumber enters the United States at a significantly higher cost than at any point in recent history. And here's what makes this different from previous trade disputes. In the past, there were negotiating windows. There were voluntary export restraints that let both sides manage volumes. There were agreements, the most recent of which expired in 2015, that created a framework for trade. This time, there is no agreement. There is no active negotiation. And the USMCA review, scheduled for July 1st, 2026, will force both sides to the table. But until then, the tariffs remain. And the cost flows downhill, from the border to the distributor, to the builder, to the home buyer, every single time. Now, let me show you what this means in dollars. The National Association of Home Builders conducted a survey of its members in the spring of 2025. The result was stark. Builders estimated an average cost increase of $10,900 per home due to tariff actions across all building materials, not just lumber, steel, aluminum, copper, appliances, cabinets, gypsum, light fixtures, HVAC components. $204 billion worth of goods go into new residential construction every year. $14 billion of that is imported, and tariffs touch almost all of it. But lumber was the single largest contributor to the cost increase. An earlier NAHB estimate attributed roughly $4,900 of the increase directly to higher lumber prices alone. A separate analysis by the Center for American Progress put the total tariff impact even higher, $17,500 per new home. That study calculated that $27 billion in additional tariff costs, spread across the current rate of approximately 1.5 million new homes per year, adds that amount to every single unit built. And the downstream effect is devastating. The center projected that tariff-driven cost increases will result in 450,000 fewer homes being built through 2030. Let that number sit for a moment. 450,000 homes that will never be built. In a country that already has a housing deficit of 4 million units. In a market where 3/4 of households cannot afford a median-priced new home. In a country where building material costs have already risen 34% since December 2020, far outpacing general inflation. Where home ownership is the most unaffordable it has been since March of 2022. Where in 2019, your mortgage payment consumed roughly 21% of median household income. And today, it consumes more than 30%. This is the hidden tax. You will never see it on a receipt. It does not appear on your closing documents as a line item called tariff surcharge, but it is embedded in every board, every beam, every panel. It is in the 2x4 that frames your bedroom wall. It is in the engineered beam that spans your living room. It is in the oriented strand board that sheathes your house before the siding goes on. It is in the kitchen cabinets that the administration slapped a separate 25% tariff on, scheduled to increase to 50% by 2027. And because 93% of new homes are built with wood, there is no realistic way around it. Now, some will argue that the solution is straightforward. Produce more lumber domestically, cut the dependence, and there is a case for that. The U.S. Lumber Coalition, which represents American producers, points out that domestic mills have added 8 billion board feet of production capacity since 2016. They have produced 30 billion additional board feet of softwood lumber during that period. They argue that America can now supply up to 95% of its own lumber needs. And they claim that duties on Canadian lumber account for only 0.04% of the price of a new home. That is their number. But it deserves scrutiny. First, the species matter. Canadian spruce pine fir cannot simply be swapped for southern yellow pine in every building application. They have different structural properties, different moisture characteristics, different grading standards, and different market acceptance among builders who have used Canadian SPF for their entire careers. Second, the logistics matter enormously. Canadian mills are connected to American markets through rail networks and trucking corridors that have been optimized over decades. 61% of Canadian lumber ships by rail. The infrastructure exists. Building equivalent supply chains from new domestic sources, particularly from federal lands that currently have limited harvesting, takes years, not months. Years. Third, and this is the part that rarely gets discussed, the Canadian supply is actually shrinking on its own. Mill closures and curtailments accelerated through 2024 and 2025. Multiple facilities across British Columbia and Quebec reduced output or shut down entirely. Wildfires in Western Canada have devastated timber stands. The mountain pine beetle epidemic continues to reduce harvestable inventory in British Columbia, the country's largest lumber-producing province. The Canadian share of American lumber imports has been declining for a decade, dropping 11 percentage points since 2016, with European suppliers, particularly from Germany and Sweden, stepping in to fill part of the gap. So even without tariffs, the supply equation was tightening. The tariffs accelerated a trend that was already underway, and now Canada is responding, not by fighting for access to the American market, but by leaving it. In early February 2026, industry data showed that Canadian lumber producers are increasingly redirecting exports to China. If you watched our previous video, you know that Canada signed a $7 billion agricultural market access deal with Beijing in January. Lumber is part of that broader pivot. When the largest buyer puts a 45% surcharge on your product, you find other buyers. And when those other buyers are in a country of 1.4 billion people with a construction sector that dwarfs any single market in the world, the math works. Every board foot that goes to Shanghai is a board foot that does not go to Atlanta, or Denver, or Phoenix, or any of the other fast-growing Sunbelt markets where housing construction is most needed. And the people caught in the middle are the people trying to buy a home. Steve Martinez is the president of Tradewinds General Contracting in Boise, Idaho. He builds high-end multifamily homes. He recently showed a reporter from CNBC through one of his job sites and said something that captures the entire problem in a few words. This entire house is built out of wood. Wood on the floor, wood on the walls, wood on the ceiling. You cannot build a house like this without a large number of wood products, and all of his contracts are fixed price. From the time he bids a project to the time he starts to, the time he orders materials, prices can change drastically. That uncertainty is one of the hidden costs of tariffs that never makes it into the headline number. Builders cannot plan. They cannot lock in budgets. And the ones who can absorb some of the cost are doing it not by raising prices, but by offering bigger incentives. D.R. Horton, the largest home builder in the United States, told investors in its earnings call that affordability constraints have led the company to increase buyer incentives to keep sales moving. Mortgage rate buy-downs, closing cost assistance, adjusted upgrade packages. They are eating the cost. But that cannot last forever. And for smaller builders, there is no margin to eat. The tariff increase flows directly into the price tag. Now let me make this personal for the home buyer. If you earn $100,000 a year, you could afford 65% of homes listed for sale in 2019. Today, you can afford 37%. Nearly half the market has disappeared for you. If you earn $75,000, which describes teachers, nurses, firefighters, tradespeople, and police officers across much of the country, you could afford 49% of listings in 2019. Today, 21%. If you earn $50,000, a third of American households fall at or below this level. You could afford 28% of listings in 2019. Today, 9%. 9. The affordability window is closing for the American middle class, not because of one single cause, but because of the convergence of several. Mortgage rates near 6%. A decade of underbuilding after the Great Recession that created a 4 million unit deficit. Insurance premiums rising so fast in climate-exposed states like Florida, California, and Louisiana that some properties are becoming effectively uninsurable, and you cannot get a mortgage on an uninsurable house. And now, on top of all of that, a tariff structure that adds thousands of dollars to every new home before a single family moves in. And the regional variation makes it worse. In the Northeast, where the housing supply gap is the deepest, current construction trends suggest the deficit will never close under present conditions. In the Midwest, it would take roughly 4 decades. In the West, 6.5 years. Only in the South, where construction has been strongest, does the timeline drop to about 3 years. And it is precisely in those southern and western markets where lumber demand is highest and where tariff-driven cost increases hit the hardest. The National Association of Home Builders estimates that for every $1,000 increase in the price of a new home, over 115,000 additional households are priced out of the market. So when tariffs add $10,900 to the average new home, that is well over 1 million additional households pushed further from ownership. These are not abstractions. These are families making real decisions about where to live, whether to have children, and whether home ownership is even a possibility in their lifetime. Redfin calls it the Great Housing Reset. Not a crash, not a correction, a years-long grind where incomes slowly catch up to prices, but only if nothing else pushes costs higher. Their analysis suggests it will take about 5 years for the market to return to anything resembling normal affordability. 5 years of wages slowly outpacing home prices. 5 years of incremental improvement. But that forecast assumed stable construction costs. Tariffs are pushing costs higher, and every dollar added to the cost of building a home extends that timeline. Young Americans are already making drastic adjustments. Multi-generational housing is surging. Adult children moving back in with parents. Garages being converted into separate suites. In a November survey of over 100 renovation professionals, multi-generational features were the most commonly predicted design trend for 2026. not open concept kitchens, not smart home technology, extra bedrooms for adult children who cannot afford to live on their own. Voters in the last election, especially young ones, made it clear that lowering housing costs is their top priority. Both parties have acknowledged the problem. Both have proposed solutions. But the policy machinery is working against itself. That is, the America that tariffs on building materials are accelerating. And here's the contradiction that should concern everyone, regardless of where you stand on trade policy. The stated goal of tariffs on Canadian lumber is to protect American producers and strengthen domestic supply chains. That is a legitimate policy objective, but the administration has also publicly stated that it wants to lower housing costs. It has discussed declaring a national housing emergency. It has pushed for deregulation to accelerate permitting and construction. It has encouraged more home building. But simultaneously, it is imposing tariffs that directly increase the cost of the single most important material in residential construction. You cannot lower housing costs and raise lumber costs at the same time. The math does not work. One objective cancels the other, and right now the tariffs are winning. Lumber futures are trading near $600 per thousand board feet as of mid-February 2026. That is not a record. The record was roughly $1,700 during the pandemic spike of May 2021, but do not be deceived by that comparison. Mills were producing at a loss for much of 2025. Multiple facilities curtailed production or closed permanently. The supply tightening that caused is now colliding with the spring building season. Mortgage rates dropped to 6.06% in January, the lowest in over 3 years, which briefly lifted buyer activity before pending sales plunged 9.3% in December. Analysts expect upward price pressure on lumber through the second quarter of 2026, particularly if housing starts increase as forecast. NAHB projects starts rising to 1.5 million units, up 8 to 9% year over year. More demand, less supply, higher tariffs. That equation has only one outcome. Now, here is what to watch. There are 4 pressure points converging in the next several months, and any one of them could reshape this story. First, the Commerce Department's administrative review of Canadian lumber duties. If the rate increases from 14.5% to 34.5% as signaled, it will be the most significant escalation of the softwood lumber dispute in a generation. Canadian producers would face combined duties and tariffs approaching 45%. At that level, some Canadian mills simply cannot export to the United States at a profit, which means less supply, higher prices, and more cost passed to American homebuyers. Second, the USMCA joint review begins July 1st, 2026. This is the mandatory 6-year review of the trade agreement that governs commerce between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Lumber will be one of the most contentious items on the table. Canada has already begun redirecting lumber exports to other markets, including China, as tariffs have made the American market less viable. The review could reshape the terms of lumber trade for the next decade. Or it could collapse in acrimony. Either outcome changes the math for American home builders. Third, the Supreme Court. The justices returned from recess on February 20th. They are expected to rule on the constitutionality of IEEPA tariffs, which could have profound implications for presidential trade authority broadly. While the lumber-specific tariffs are Section 232, not IEEPA, a ruling that limits the executive's power to impose tariffs unilaterally could shift the entire landscape. If the court rules against IEEPA tariff authority, the political momentum to challenge other tariff programs accelerates. And fourth, the midterm elections in November. 60% of Americans already disapprove of tariffs. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that 90% of tariff costs are passed directly to consumers. Housing affordability is the number one concern for voters under 40. 6 Republicans already crossed party lines in February to vote against the Canada Tariff Emergency Declaration. Retiring Representative Don Bacon of Nebraska estimated that 30 more wanted to cross, but feared primary challenges. If lumber prices rise through the spring and summer, if new home construction slows, if the affordability squeeze worsens heading into fall, the political calculus changes. The hidden tax on American homes is not a metaphor. It is a real cost, embedded in real materials, paid by real families. $10,900 per home, according to the builders who swing the hammers. $17,500 per home, according to the analysts who study the data. 450,000 homes that will never be built, 75% of households already priced out. And a trade policy that is simultaneously trying to protect an industry and making the product of that industry unaffordable for the people it was supposed to help. The question is not whether someone will pay. Someone always pays. The question is whether the people making the decisions understand who is paying, and whether the people paying realize who made the decision. The next 6 months will answer both questions. If you want to follow how this story unfolds through the Commerce Review, the USMCA negotiations, the Supreme Court ruling, and the fall election, subscribe. because the cost of shelter in America is being decided right now, and most people do not even know it.